So my degree is in communication, my MA, my PhD, my undergrad as well. I identify very strongly as a rhetorician. And in teaching public speaking for years, I teach it from the perspective of the rhetorical tradition. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what that means. One, because I think it's useful just to understand these terms in general, but more specifically because if I don't define these terms now, I know I'm going to end up talking about them later on in the course, and I don't want that to be confusing. So I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about how the rhetorical tradition affects our study of public speaking. So to begin with, what does the term rhetoric even mean? Well, the term has a long heritage dating back to ancient Greece, and there's very good scholarship indicating that, in fact, Plato was a person who coined rhetoric, the term rhetoric. It certainly has some bad connotations today. In some ways that is justified, in many ways it's not. The term itself has been defined variously throughout the centuries. So what are some of these definitions? Well, Aristotle defined rhetoric as the faculty of discovering in any particular case the available means of persuasion. So it's an ability to sort of see all the possible routes for putting together a persuasive speech or an informative speech, what have you. Being able to sort of identify all the possible paths. Plato, in one version, talked about rhetoric as the art of winning the soul by discourse. Quintilian, a Roman rhetorician, defined rhetoric as something that happens when the good person is speaking well. Now, John Locke, we jump forward, quite a ways in history. John Locke has a far less generous definition of rhetoric, and he calls it a powerful instrument of error and deceit. More contemporaneously, at least someone who's alive, Gerard Hauser identifies rhetoric as communication that attempts to coordinate social action. Its goal is to influence human choices on specific matters that require immediate attention. So you've got rhetoric here as a way of getting people onto the same page. Now, in some ways I'm going to duck the question, what is rhetoric? Because I'm going to say the rhetorical tradition, the millennia of research into and study and writing on persuasive speaking and the very nature of rhetoric is the tradition that we're going to swim in for this particular course. And we're going to do so because the rhetorical tradition helps us study the art of public speaking. And I choose art here very specifically. And so one of the things that the rhetorical tradition gives us is a way of studying something like an art. And the tradition speaks to us in terms of saying, how do we study art? How are we going to study public speaking? Well, we would acquire skills in this like we would acquire skills in many other arts, through instruction, imitation, and practice. So in terms of instruction, that's in some ways the function of this class and certainly the function of these videos. You have no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to studying what works in public speaking. Through instruction, we can see what has been learned over the years. What are some good pieces of advice, or good tips, or good tricks when it comes to putting together, practicing, or performing a speech. But that's not alone, right? It's not just instruction. Rather, there is so much that can be gained through a study of imitation. And I don't mean plagiarizing here. I mean finding someone that you think speaks well and speaks in a way that you can imitate. You can pull off, okay? And one of the things we looked at in an earlier lecture was public speaking is so situated within its culture, within its time, with the concerns of the audience, the abilities of the speaker, that we certainly want to be able to say, it's not a universal form of instruction. Rather, I want to be able to find someone who I can imitate and analyze what they do so that I might find lessons that are useful for me in a given speaking situation. And then, of course, the most obvious leg of practice is desperately important to public speaking. You have to practice. Having merely an instruction or theoretical knowledge of public speaking doesn't do you a lot of good if you can't deliver the speech well. You're going to hammer out that skill against the anvil of practice. There's no way around it. And certainly in this class, I'm going to ask you many times to practice these skills. In privacy if you wish, and then hopefully you will post speeches online, because getting that type of feedback is very important as well to your practice. Having other eyes on your work, having eyes outside your own body. So the rhetorical tradition gives us this sort of general rubric, this general framework for understanding how we might go about studying something as dynamic and highly personal as speech skill. The other thing that we're going to take from the public speaking tradition is the steps in creating a speech, often called the canons of rhetoric. These are canons as in principles, not boom boom cannons. So the canons of rhetoric start with invention, merely coming up with ideas, figuring out what you're going to be talking about. And once again, when we think about the types of speaking situations we'd find ourselves in, that's pretty important. If you are presenting a new idea to an audience that knows nothing about that, you got to think through what points, what ideas do they need to have in order to understand this issue. Or let's say you're trying to persuade a group that knows a great deal about the situation, but they just happen to disagree with you. So there you've got to think about, well, what do they need to hear? Or what evidence do I have that maybe they're not aware of? But invention is just coming up with ideas as it relates to your speech purpose. But once you have those ideas, we need to turn our attention to arrangement. What's the most effective way to put together these various components of a speech? Now, there are, an infinite number of ways to arrange a speech. The speeches that we're doing in this class are going to aim towards clarity of arrangement. Okay? So there are perhaps a lot of times where your goals of arrangement might be something very different, narrative and scope, emotional and direction. But what we're going to be working on, the goal is clarity and arrangement. By that I mean you will be delivering speeches that are easy for an audience to follow along with. If they were taking notes, their notes would pretty much look like your notes. Okay? So how do you arrange the speech in a way that's easy for the audience to follow along with and makes sense, is logical? Beyond that, once we've sort of figured out what we want to talk about, we figured out sort of roughly how we want to arrange it, then we can start thinking about style. What's the vocabulary that you want to be using as you move through this speech? Okay. Are there certain words or metaphors that are going to help your audience understand, or certain phrases that are going to make it more confusing for your audience, or are going to invite disagreement rather than agreement? What is the vocabulary you want to attach to these ideas? Then we move into memory. Now, for the ancient rhetors, memory was tremendously important. They would deliver these massively long presentations. In this class, you're not going to be memorizing manuscripts. We're going to be working in more of an extemporaneous mode. But memory is still very important here because you want to at least remember how that speech is arranged. So you don't have to constantly be reading. So you don't have to constantly be working off your notes. So you want to have the memory that comes from practice and from good preparation so that you don't have to be sitting there looking simply at your manuscript. Okay? And then finally we end with delivery. Hugely important. Certainly this is where everybody's attention is. Oh, good speeches need good delivery, and indeed they do. But a good speech has all of these elements performed well. Good ideas, arranged well with the right vocabulary, known deeply by the speaker, and delivered well. Okay? If you have terrible ideas in a confusing format, but you sound awesome, that's still not a good speech. Okay? So we in this class are going to be taking from the rhetorical tradition these canons of rhetoric, these principles of public speaking, so that we can compose speeches that are good in and of themselves as well as delivered well. So that's in essence what we're going to be doing. And you'll notice also that this pattern of moving from idea through arrangement all the way up to delivery, this matches what we're doing for each speech assignment. So when we get into the informative speech, for example, we'll spend some time talking about informative invention, coming up with ideas, figuring out what you need to include and not include. Then we'll move on to arrangement. How do you put this together in a way that's going to be easy to understand? Then we move on to style. What is the language that we're using here? Into memory through practice, and certainly we'll spend time talking about delivery. So each one of these, as I mentioned in I think it was the last lecture, we move from impromptu to informative to persuasive because we're moving from basic to more moving parts to more moving parts. These scaffold in that way. Within each speech, we're moving from invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. onto the next one, invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery, and so on and so forth. So I just kind of wanted to make sure I defined these terms, gave you a sense for how we're going to be, the various ways in which we're going to be studying public speaking through instruction, imitation, and practice, and then finally touched on what are the key vocabulary terms of this course when it comes to the study of public speaking. I come to this through the rhetorical tradition. That's merely one choice. You could study public speaking in any number of ways, from a number of different cultural standpoints. This is the one that I've chosen in this class. This is the one that I've spent a lot of time refining, and it has tremendous advantages when it comes to thinking clearly and logically through speeches. But it is but one way of putting together speech and thinking about speeches. But it's a pretty good one. It's been with us for a couple thousand years.